some other questions. Such a sweet cat. Where did you model it? I originally modeled it when I was living in New York, and rendering two tiny kittens in a studio apartment in the Upper East Side did not get me a lot of sleep. And then when
Really?
I moved to, they were running along the walls like they thought they were in a John Woo movie. Um, when I moved
Brilliant.
to Brooklyn, well, first Chinatown, then first
Yeah.
Brooklyn, then Chinatown. They came with me, obviously. And when I moved to New Jersey, they weren't too sure about that, but they did that. When I moved from New Jersey to England, they did not like that. And it's one of the main reasons why moving back to the States would be difficult because I'm not leaving my cats behind and I don't think they'll make it.
So,
Question for you, though, from Todd.
yeah.
Could you use the same texture in multiple materials and one material is metallic or emissive or just normal color, etc.?
Yeah, of course. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. One thing to remember about a texture is it's just a set of information. You're
Yep.
literally got these parameters. So back in Blender for a second. Um,
Would it make sense if we remind people that the reason it's called UV is each vertex has an X, Y, Z coordinate, but you're trying to map two-dimensional image information
yep.
onto three-dimensional space information, so you need two more coordinates for each vertex. The U and the V is the X, Y on the two-dimensional. So this
Yes.
bit here has the UV of 0, 0, which is that part of the image, and the X, Y, Z, which tells you where it is in space.
Yeah, and it just maps it to here. So this image here is actually quite wasteful.
Mhm.
If you were using this, all of this area that's outside the sort of lighter grey cross that we have there is wasted space in theory. But what you would end up doing is say we this area here that said high, if we made that area larger, we would increase the resolution on that particular face. The downside of that is you can end up with areas that have more detail than are necessary. And this is why it's important when you're UV unwrapping your model that you actually have a uniform distribution of your UV unwrap. Otherwise, you'll end up with areas that are stretched, distorted, or even just have more detail. If it's a pattern like a wood pattern, it would look twice as dense or half as dense. And that really stands out. Humans have this knack of spotting stuff. Now, I came in here to just play around with the shading workspace. So when we're adjusting this and we're saying it's 100% metallic, i.e., white, it's like having a texture that's 100% white or having a texture that's 100% black, and that's all that we're doing when we're adjusting this slider here. Now, once you actually plug this in, you're just saying that part of it at this point is going to be, in this case, just white. And a texture is just a way of controlling this value rather than it just being uniform. A great example of this would be to add in, I love a Voronoi texture, so let's bring up a Voronoi texture. Again, this is going to be mapped by default to a UV space, and the default cube is already unwrapped. But if I plug this in, let's do the distance and plug it into the roughness, we'll end up with parts of our model that are shiny and parts that are not. If you go to a steeper angle, you can much more easily see the reflective areas of your model. And we can see there, we've got these, it's almost like puddles at this point in time. Now, we can change how things are mapped as well. You can plug a different coordinate system into this if you want to. But generally, you can just plug things in like this. I can make this nice and large, like so. And then it looks like you've got puddles on the surface. And you could do the same. You could swap this out for, instead of a Voronoi texture, you can plug in something else that's often used is under texture here. We can pick a Musgrave texture. So that's more cloud-like. And we plug that into where the roughness is going to stand out a little bit more. There you go. There's more of your puddle type stuff that you can have. Almost looks like a river running across the surface. But adding textures like this, whether it's procedural or something you've drawn on, or a mixture of both, because you can do a mixture of both, it just adds variation to the surface of your model. And one of the things that really helps a model stand out is when you start adding some sort of textural information to it, whether it's procedural or not, because suddenly it becomes a bit more believable. Unless you're going for a cartoon effect or a flat shaded effect, adding detail, even if you scaled this up, suddenly this surface, it almost looks like a granite work surface from a distance now, doesn't it? Let's make that.
It does.
An obsidian cube.
Sorry, I had myself muted while Caboodle decided to start clawing my hand playfully because I thought if I start screaming,
People will wonder what's going on in the background.
and if they're wearing headphones, they'll get grumpy at me.
That's a very good point. I've just seen the time,
Yep.
and I'm enjoying myself. But before we wrap up for the evening, I hope that answered your question, Todd. Can you use the same texture in multiple materials? Yes. In fact, that's quite optimal, by the way. If you're
Yes,
reusing
it
a
is.
texture over and over again, um, and then I know in Unreal, for instance, you can have an instance of something, and once you've got that instance, it reduces the draw calls massively. So yeah, using a texture again will reduce the render RAM limit that you have. So if you're especially if it's a large texture. So a great example of reusing a texture over and over again would be having a texture atlas where you've got multiple textures for multiple objects on one texture. I believe that's exactly how Minecraft does its textures. It's all on one big sheet. Whether or not, oh dear, Todd, oh dear, his internet went out during my answer.
I saw.
Very opportune. Um, so yeah, it is an optimization step, and it will depend on the platform you're going for. Because whilst it'd be really awesome to bake all of your textures into one 8K texture, that may increase your loading times. Or in a particular, why spend? Let's say it's 10 seconds for an 8K texture. I'm just making this number up. It's not real world, but for the sake of argument, if it took 10 seconds to load up an 8K texture, which is massive compared to like a 512 by 512. But say the particular level you're in or the particular models you were loading up only took up a 512 by 512 portion of that huge area, you'd have maybe a quarter of a second loaded time versus 10 seconds, or it may be even a larger difference than that. So, whilst it can be more optimal to store everything in one place, it has its downsides as well. And the other thing is if you're working in a team, you would need to make sure that those assets were available. If you had two artists working on something, and you've got working on the same file, that's impossible when it comes to which version is true. So having multiple textures when you're working and then combining them later on into a bigger atlas, that is also something that's often done. And then you're working with small, really quick to edit files, and then later on you can put them into large maps if you need to. Will MIP mapping work well with big texture atlas? As long as it's a power of two, yes, because then it just works. What you will end up with if you're not careful is if you go too low detail. So if you've got a 4K texture, so 4096 pixels wide by 4096 pixels high, we end up with you might take up too little space, and then when it's mapped down, you end up with garbage. You end up with something that should have been many more pixels. But you can make that decision as you play with them. If you were
I have a cat on my arm, so I can't use the computer very well. If you were very arty-farty and more knowledgeable than Daz, as well as spelling, you could use the RGB and A channels for different things from the same texture. Yes,
yes,
that was my question with the
yeah,
thing earlier.
yeah, we were talking
The,
about that earlier, Daz, where you have I know it's a standard in Unreal to have ambient occlusion, metallic, and roughness on the channels. One thing to bear in mind is that not all image formats, especially PNG,
mm,
the way that they store information, the alpha channel is not always treated equally. So that's something to bear
okay.
in mind. I don't know the details offhand, but you do have to be careful when you do that because you may end up with some parts of your texture being more compressed than others. I think the alpha channel on PNG is actually a compressed channel, whereas everything else in it is lossless. Don't quote me on that. I know there's something funky with using the alpha channel, but yes, you you're quite right. You can use the different channels as different things. In fact, I do that in the modeling BCS modeling course. So we actually paint a going to Munster's question earlier. We paint different textures on our barrels. So we have a metallic layer, we have a roughness layer, and we have a diffuse layer, and we manually paint those on. So do check that out if you want a more detailed exploration of texture painting.